Welcome to the AMATIC 2019 webinar series. My name is John Oakes and I am the interim AMATIC Professional Development Coordinator, and today's presentation is Improving Student Placement Using Multiple Measures Assessment with Elizabeth Barnett, and is co-sponsored by the MAA and AMATIC. So please note that the views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATIC, and any commercial products mentioned by presenters are not endorsed by AMATIC. And McGraw-Hill Higher Education is proud to support the 2019 AMATIC webinar series. And now we are going to switch to the presenter slides. So as the presenter gets ready to bring up her slides, Keith Hubbard from the MAA is going to introduce our presenter. So if everyone could welcome the presenter in the chat room, and thank the MAA again for co-sponsoring the webinar with us, that would be great. So I am going to turn it over to Keith right now.
Thank you, John. As John said, I'm Keith Hubbard. I am the chair of the Mathematics Association of America's Committee on Articulation and Placement, and we are very privileged to have Elizabeth Barnett with us. Dr. Barnett is very well known nationally, but not in mathematics circles. At least I would contend she's not as well known in mathematics circles as she should be, because her research really centers on these transitions both in mathematics and English. She is the lead for the Multiple Measures Assessment Project at Columbia University's Center for the Analysis of Post-Secondary Readiness. She is also lead of the Community College Research Center's project Reshaping the College Transition, a study of early assessment and curriculum interventions. She's going to share some of her research and also a few thoughts about implementation, but we'd like to encourage you, please, as John mentioned, use the chat feature. Depending on your web interface, it will be at the bottom or at the top right, to ask questions throughout. I'll be collecting those questions, and Elizabeth would very much like to respond to items of further interest. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Keith. I'm very pleased to be here and pleased to be invited to talk with this group. I'm going to talk today about a trend that we're seeing around the country toward the use of multiple measures in the assessment of students who are enrolling in colleges and universities to make sure that they're placed appropriately into college level or developmental education courses. I don't seem to be able to advance my slides. Try this here. Okay, that seems to be loosening it up. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is the rationale for using multiple measures for placement, some of the choices that people make when they decide that they want to develop a multiple measures system, and then the results of some research that we at CAPR are doing on some colleges in New York State, the State University System of New York, 7 colleges participating with us in this research, to look at the use of a system that uses predictive analytics. And then we'll have some opportunity for discussion. Please do jump in at any time with questions. I'm going to pause every now and then, and Keith will share the questions with me that may pop up. So first of all, just by way of a background, we have many students in the US who are placing into developmental education when they go to college. So 68% of students who are entering community colleges, and it's also an issue in open access four-year institutions. And what we know is that when students start off in developmental education, when they start off requiring remediation, they're less likely to graduate. And of course, that's partly because many times they're less prepared. But there's also evidence that just starting off in developmental education, essentially in non-college level courses, is associated with lower completion rates. And that may be because of, the types of courses offered. It may be because of, students' reaction to being told that they're not college ready. But in any case, what we think is important is making sure that students take developmental education courses when they really need it and are not placed into them, if they could be successful in college level courses. So some of my colleagues at the Community College Research Center, especially Judy Scott Clayton and Clive Belfield, have done some research comparing the results of single placement tests, the AccuPlacer and in the past the Compass, and looking at placement using that one placement test as compared with placement that was done, or the prediction that was done using a very rich data set. So using a whole lot of information from students pre-college years that was then used to predict success in college level courses. So what happened is that they found that students who were placed using the exam, were often placed appropriately, and the check boxes indicate those. So in other words, if they were placed using just the exam, they ended up with the same placement or predicted success as if they'd been placed using this rich data set. But a number of students were misplaced. So when we look at the box that says underplaced, what we see is that 29% of students, so a little over a quarter of students and 18% of math students, the quarter in English and 18% in math, were underplaced. In other words, they were placed into developmental courses when they could have succeeded in a college level course. And in this particular research, they used a criterion of B or better. So they were predicted to have gotten a B or better in a college level course, despite the fact that they were placed into a developmental course. And there were also, of course, some students who were overplaced, that were placed into who were placed into college level courses when they probably should have been placed into developmental. So in other words, those were students who were predicted to actually fail the college level course despite being placed in it using just the exam. So what we find is, let me just go back there for a minute. What we find is that over and over again, studies that look at the single placement tests indicate that it's just not doing a very good job of placing students. And typically what we're seeing is profiles like this. And this is just two colleges that were involved in some of the research that we were in. The percentage shown is the amount of variation explained by using GPA alone, and by that we mean the high school GPA, the test alone, the GPA and the test results together, and then a full model that uses a range of other factors that may be involved or may be available at a college. So what we're seeing here is that almost always the high school GPA is a much better predictor than the placement test alone. But then if you add additional elements into the model, you get even, more predictive power. And this is, again, just showing you that we get this same profile. When we look across colleges, we see, the numbers aren't really important, but what we're seeing in each case is the GPA bar is, substantially better than the test bar. So the GPA being the first one and the test being the second one. And, a very similar profile in math, although we do see that in math, the test does a little better than it does in English. So we've got a lot of reasons to think that better assessment systems are needed, taking into account the fact that when students do start in developmental education, they're less likely to complete, and that we have a lot of students starting in developmental education who don't really need to be there. And we'll spend more time talking about this later, but just over and over again, the high school GPA turns out to be the best predictor of success in college level math or English. So let me just pause there for a moment. Are there any questions or comments so far, Keith?
Elizabeth, there is one question that I think is timely right now. Are there any studies that look at department-created tests? I know the data you just quoted were for national tests like Occuplacer.
I mean, certainly colleges have done their own assessments, looked at the extent to which their tests, adequately predicted what they thought they were predicting. But I don't know of any larger studies. And I don't know of any what you might call rigorous studies. So in this case, we're going to talk about a random assignment study, and I'm not aware of any of those using local tests.
Thank you. There's also a question, does the age of the high school GPA factor in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to ask you to put that on hold for a moment because I've got a really nice graph that shows the response to that. So yeah, it does make a difference, but maybe not as much as you might think.
Okay, that's all for now.
All right. So why use multiple measures? So we've seen that existing placement tests aren't doing a great job of predicting success in college level courses. Secondly, almost across the board, more information will improve predictions. And last of all, there are a number of questions about whether it might be helpful to have different measures for example, students who've been out of school for a long time, what are often called the non-traditional students. And in general, just looking across different subgroups of students to see if we can do a better job of placing them than we're doing with existing systems. So as the word is getting out about some of the topics we've discussed so far, what we see is that colleges are in fact beginning to use measures in addition to standardized tests. And I say in addition for the most part. It's usually not giving up the test altogether, but using more information. So some of my colleagues at Capper did a national scan and surveyed colleges around the country to find out whether they were changing their practices when it came to assessment or the instructional approaches used for developmental education. And what they found is that, as you can see in both math and reading, there are quite a number of colleges that are now using additional measures as compared with research conducted by other folks, by Fields and Parsat in 2011. And this is true of both community colleges and public four-year colleges. And as you can see, it's a little more likely to happen in math than in reading or reading and writing. And when they asked which measures were being used, in addition to, almost everybody was using the standardized tests, but about 40% were using some information from the high school transcript. In some cases it was GPA, in some cases it was course grades, and that's the second most common measure used from the high school record. In a number of cases, they were also looking at the student's planned course of study, and especially as we look at some of the changes going on in math pathways, we see different math courses being offered to students with different intended majors or programs of study. And then a few of them were looking at other indicators of motivation or commitment. So, typically that would be some kind of a non-cognitive assessment, and we'll talk more about those as well. So if you're thinking about using a multiple measure system, there are different decisions you have to make. And this chart comes from a paper that's on the Capper website that talks about what some of the options are available. Basically, what you've got to do is figure out what measures you want to use, how you're going to combine them, because as soon as you have more than one, you've got to kind of figure out what to do with them. And then what you're going to use the results for. So in most cases, the results are being used for placement into traditional courses, but sometimes they're being used for placement into alternative courses, such as, co-requisite courses are becoming more and more common. And in some cases, they're being used for placement into support services. And, that might mean that students who are, within a certain range might get extra academic support, or it might mean that they get, participate in a college success course or something like that. So going back to the measures, there are those that are administered at the college, and so those can be handled and controlled by the college and done at the time that a student enters. And then there are some that need to be obtained from elsewhere. And as soon as you're obtaining measures from, say, the high school record, there's typically a process involved in obtaining those. And that can make the system, depending on what the college's norms have been in the past, it can be a whole process to begin obtaining student transcripts and getting the data from the transcripts entered into the college computer systems. So those are the kinds of things that need to be thought about. I'll talk a little bit more about measures and then systems and approaches. So measures, there are other placement tests. Someone mentioned the college developed ones. There are different people, people are using other commercially available products like Alex. With regard to the high school GPA, I've been mentioning how valuable that is. And, in cases where the transcript is not easily available, some colleges are considering the use of self-report data from students. Non-cognitive assessments are being tried in some places. A couple of examples are the GRIT, which can be, it's like a 8 or 12-point questionnaire that can be integrated into an existing placement test. And some are experimenting with longer, more complex assessments that provide more information. And then in some cases, computer inventories and computer skills are being assessed. Career inventories, less common. Writing examples are fairly common. Often that requires considerable time from faculty to do the assessment. So those are some of the choices that are out there. I mentioned self-report as one possibility, and there is some research, some of it's shown here on the slides, indicating that students are, pretty good about reporting their own high school GPA. Now, these may be under conditions where it's lower stakes, so colleges are thinking about the pros and cons of using self-report. Some are using self-report with some kind of a verification system. So that's certainly an option as well. And what's becoming more and more common is considering the use of the 11th grade GPA. So California is a state that's been out front on a lot of this work. And they found that the 11th grade GPA is, almost always quite similar to the 12th grade GPA. Students have done, by the 11th grade, students have done a lot of the work that they're going to do in high school, and they found it reasonable to use the 11th grade GPA for placement. So non-cognitive assessments, I think there's widespread agreement that academic knowledge is not the only ingredient that goes into being successful in college, and other factors may be important: time management, persistence, ability to interact with an instructor so that, when help is needed, those kinds of things. So some of the assessments that are out there look at a variety of different factors. And there's some belief that they may be especially useful for students that are, either older, don't have a high school record for whatever reason, or perhaps to maybe bump up a student that might be close to a placement close to a cutoff score on a placement test. So a few of the examples, both College Board and ACT have products. Those are the ones that are here. The Success Navigator has a kind of built-in academic success index that recommends whether a student should be considered for acceleration or movement, up a level in math or English. Engage has, domains across, motivation and skills, social engagement, and so on. And, both of them have some research that backs up their their value in terms of predicting success in college. I mentioned the grit scale. Grittiness has been correlated with high school GPA or with college GPA. And the Lassie out of Texas is also one that's been used fairly extensively over time and has been correlated with success in college and, has information about a lot of different domains. So let me stop there for a minute. And do we have any other questions or comments, Keith?
Elizabeth, the only additional question is comparing various tests, specifically Accuplacer versus ALEX. So this may come to bear on your next slide, actually.
No, my next slide is really getting into, in more depth into the GPA. Both Accuplacer and ALEX have some, have research behind them that, that shows that they've got, some predictive value. ALEX has the element that involves, providing opportunities for students to remediate within the system to improve their skills. There are people that are fans of each, but I don't know research that kind of compares them to each other. Okay, so shall I go ahead?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead?
Okay, so high school GPA, I want to dig into that a little bit more because, people express concerns about it. And, it's certainly worth talking through some of those. And the slides that follow here are, with special appreciation mostly to John Hetz in California, who's done a lot of thinking about these topics and a lot of presenting with different colleges that are starting to get involved with multiple measures. So this is not all of the concerns that come up, but these are the ones that I've heard most frequently, I think. So the first one has to do with, maybe the Accuplacer isn't the best test, but our test at our college is better, or whatever test that's out there that may be an improvement on existing placement tests. The second one is getting at a desire to make sure that students get the help that they really need. That, there are some students who are starting college, behind, and, there's real reason to believe that they could be helped by developmental education. So the question there is, should we be using a measure that maybe takes opportunities away from them? The third one is high school GPA only being predictive for recent graduates. And that's the one that was brought up earlier. And then one that comes up a lot is the question about whether different high schools grade differently or are overall better quality, whether some high schools are better quality, provide a better education than others, and therefore, should be treated differently. So this is a slide, actually this one comes from North Carolina, from Brad Boston, who's also done a lot of good work in North Carolina. And what they did, it was done in collaboration with some of my colleagues, Belfield and Crosta, and they looked across different tests that were being used in different North Carolina colleges at the time of the research. So I think that was, in around 2011. And essentially what you see in this chart is that across all the tests that were in use, you had a fair amount of variation, but the last bar on this slide is the high school GPA, and essentially it was doing, a considerably better job of predicting success in math or English college level courses than any of the tests that were out there. And, what we've basically heard is that, by people who are experts in the testing field is that often tests predict test performance pretty well, subsequent test performance, but grades tend to predict actual grades better. So, students who are earning a high school GPA are earning it because not only do they have the academic knowledge, but they also have shown up to school, they've completed assignments, they've persevered. And so sometimes people will even call the high school GPA a non-cognitive measure in itself. So developmental education outcomes. So there are some students who would be better off going through developmental education. There are certainly students, who could not go to college otherwise. But these are the results of a meta-analysis that was done by some of our other colleagues. And what it was looking at was a range of student outcomes, a range of studies that examined student outcomes in college for students who were placed into developmental education. And they're split into students who were closer to college ready, that's the higher level students, and then students who were well below college ready. And what we were trying to summarize here were the number of studies where students placed in developmental education had a positive outcome, a null outcome. In other words, their results were no different than if they had not been placed into developmental education, or a negative outcome. And so what we're seeing here is that we've got a lot of students who had, well, the highest number is a null outcome. So those are students who ended up with the same outcomes, but actually were delayed in their college persistence because they spent time in developmental education courses. And then there were, some that had the negative outcomes, especially the higher level students. The lower level students, it's more of a mixed result. So I think, the kind of takeaway from this is, you really want students in developmental education only if they truly need to be there. Otherwise, you're better off giving them access to college level courses with extra supports if they need them. So this is the graph that I referred to earlier. So this is coming from the California research, and it's looking at, it's comparing the high school GPA with the AccuPlacer. And that gray line you can see at the 0.1 level for English and at the 0.2 level for math. That's the AccuPlacer. And then the across the bottom axis, we're seeing semesters out of college, or sorry, out of high school. So you can see that, for students right out of high school, the GPA, those are all those, squiggly lines are, GPA at different levels or different grade levels. So you can see the high school GPA is doing considerably better at predicting success in college level courses when students are just out of high school. And the longer they go out of high school, the less predictive the high school GPA is. But with English, even if you're 20 semesters out of high school, the GPA is doing a better job. With math, it gets, once you're like 6 or so years or semesters out of high school, it's getting closer. But, you still see that for the most part, the GPA is doing a better job until you're, well, if you take the linear version, you see that until like 15 semesters out, the GPA is doing a better job of predicting success in math, and 20 plus for English. So essentially, you're getting better results from the GPA, and then maybe there's some point, some number of years out of high school where you want to make sure you're using other measures as well. So then
Elizabeth, if I could interject on that last slide.
Yep.
There was a question about what the values on the y-axis represented.
Semesters out of high school, and then on the, I'm afraid I don't know. I would assume that was, I think it's variance explained, but I'm not totally sure. Sorry about that.
Well, just reading the bottom, I'm wondering if it isn't the correlation between that and college success.
Yep, you can read and I cannot. Good. Yep, that's the correlation. Okay. I was thinking back to the.
Then as long as I'm interrupting you, if I could ask about the slide previous to that, William asked, how did you assess whether the result was null or negative? So could you just provide a few clarifying words there?
Well, this is combining information across a lot of different studies and a lot of different outcomes. So in some cases the outcome was, pass the next college level course. In some cases it was persistence. In some cases it was credits accumulated. There were several different outcomes involved here. So if it was null, then a student in developmental education would be getting the same outcome as a student who had gone directly into college level courses. But at the same time, they would have been essentially delayed in their progress. If they were negative, they would have been getting a worse outcome than a student who was placed into a college level course.
Thank you.
Okay, so college grades and feeder high schools. So this was again research out of North Carolina that was looking at different colleges and their main feeder high schools, and what they were looking for was the extent to which you had parallel grades earned at the high school and the college level. The takeaway from this was that there tended to be about a 0.6 difference between the high school GPA and the college GPA, with the college GPA being lower, but that for the most part, you were seeing a pretty parallel pattern, and that it didn't vary to any great extent by the specific high schools involved. Okay, so ways to combine measures. So one way to combine measures that's not on here is what we would call a waiver. So in some places what they're doing is they're saying, okay, if you come in with, and many people are doing this, if you come in with a certain ACT or SAT score, you won't have to test. You'll be waived from testing. Or, if you come in with a certain high school GPA, you'll be waived from testing. In other cases, the information is being combined in somewhat more complex ways. So one is an algorithm determined by a predictive model, and the SUNY research that I'm going to talk about in a minute uses that, where you're taking historical data from the college, using it to predict outcomes in first college level courses, and using whatever data the college has available. What that usually involves is a placement test, high school information, and usually not much else. But there could be situations where you have prior college information, or prior college grades or something like that. Placement is sometimes done in those cases. And so the historical data is analyzed. You come up with a predictive model that assigns weights to the different measures, and then students are placed using that kind of set of weighted measures. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Decision rules, that's where the college basically decides kind of an order in which a series of decisions will be made, and sets cutoffs. Decision bands involves usually students who test into a certain range having the opportunity to be bumped up if other information is available that shows that that they're likely to succeed. And then directed self-placement, where students are provided with information and then ultimately have the opportunity to decide where they fit. So here's the algorithm example. Basically, student applies, there might be exemptions. If not, the information is fed into this algorithm, generating a probability of success. Faculty determine what the probability is that they consider to be college level versus remedial level, and they're placed, either into college level or remedial. And by the way, you probably noticed, I'm using remedial and developmental interchangeably here. Decision rule example, student applies, there might be some exemptions. If not, maybe the high school record is looked at first. This is just one example. And if a student has a GPA, let's say below a 2.5, they would take the AccuPlacer test and then be placed accordingly. It could be the other way around. It could be the student is tested first, and if they place at a certain point, their high school record is looked at. This is the decision band, which could be considered a form of decision rules, but it's basically just saying that there's a certain band within which additional information will be considered. So any questions about some of those ways of combining data?
Yes, Frank had a question about self-placement and if there had been any studies about self-placement or informed self-placement in comparison to the other placement methods.
Well, a form of that is happening in Florida because policy has been set that any student who's graduated high school can go into a college level course. And some colleges are providing more information than others. So some students are really self-placing just, best they can, and some are getting more information. And we're seeing some pretty interesting results out of Florida State University. Some researchers there that are showing that more students, when they, in the state, as students are self-placing, you're getting higher rates overall of students obviously placing into college level courses, but also passing than in the past. So that's, I think, the best example I know of research that more or less gets at that. I'm really curious though about what happens. I think it'd be important to do a study on, where there's very clear kind of advising practices around directed self-placement and seeing how that works out.
Yes, it would be challenging to quantify the quality of the advising.
Yep, but
yes,
it's true. But at least you would know everybody got at least their session.
True. That's all I have right at the moment.
Okay, so let me share the research that we did at the State University of New York. So CAPR is actually an acronym for a center that's in its 5th year, and it's being co-led by us, Community College Research Center, and MDRC. And doing 3 studies. One is I referred to the descriptive study earlier. There's one going on of the New Mathways project in Texas. And then the one I'm going to share is the one we're doing in New York State. So with this one, we've got a 5-year project, 7 colleges, use of predictive analytics. Students are having the opportunity to opt out of the study. For those who don't, they're randomly assigned as they come into the college to be placed either using the predictive analytics system or whatever the college has normally done, which is typically a single placement test. We had students who first entered the study in the fall of 2016, and then 2 more cohorts after that, spring of 2017 and fall of 2017. So, that part of the study has wrapped up, and in just a minute, I'm going to share results from the first semester of that analysis. We also did implementation research to see what it took to actually get this work done, setting it up in each college. And we did a cost study to see what it cost to set up. Colleges are certainly very interested in the outcomes, but they also want to know, what it's going to take, both in terms of personnel time and costs. So what we were trying to learn about then was, do student outcomes improve if they're placed using this predictive analytics system, and what's involved in setting up the system. So these are our partner sites. As you can see, they're spread across the state of New York, none of them from New York City, all, other parts of the state under the SUNY system. The SUNY central office was also an important partner in this work and helped us with each stage of the research, and is also providing some of the data. So I've talked about how the predictive analytics system works. The one thing I just want to emphasize here is that while we got the historical data from each college and did the analysis, but then provided it to faculty at each college so that they could set the cut scores, so that they could determine, you know, what they were essentially looking at data on the percent of students entering a college level course and at each percent entering what proportion would pass, and setting the cut scores according to, you know, many times keeping the pass rate pretty similar to what it was, but oftentimes allowing more students to enter college level courses based on a more refined analysis. So what happened with this? So, you know, a lot of work went into setting up the system. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm going to skip directly to the outcomes during the first cohort's experience in the first semester of college. So these are students who entered in the fall of 2016. 4,700 first-year students, 5 colleges that were up and running at that point. The other 2 were running a little behind, so they entered the study the next semester. And as I said, random assignment study with close to half being assigned to business as usual, single placement test, and close to half in the treatment group, getting placed using the algorithm system, you know, with the cut score set by faculty. So one thing to take into account here is that not all the students who were tested actually entered the college. So we have 18% of students who actually did not take a course at all during that first semester. And so, you know, their results are still baked into the slides that I'm going to show you, into the graphs that I'm going to show you. So this is our treatment effects in math. And, you know, you can see your first bar, the blue bar is the control group, and the gray bar is the program group, so the students who are placed using the algorithm placement. And what we see is that somewhat more students in the program group were getting placed into college level courses. So, you know, about, what is it, 5 percentage points difference there, and about 5 percentage points in the number that actually went on and enrolled in college level courses. And we know that some students just don't enroll in any course during, you know, during their first semester, so some of that's in there. But then students, for the most part, you know, when they enrolled, they were also passing the college level courses. So you end up with about 3 percentage points difference in the number of students that first semester entered and passed their college level course. And that's based only on a difference in placement strategies. What we see in English is a much larger effect. For varied reasons, we have many more students who are placing into college level courses in English. That's a combination of, you know, the historical patterns at the college and also where the faculty set the cut scores. We have many more students who took a college level English course, and then we have about a 13 percentage point difference. Is that right? 13 plus percentage points difference in the number of the students who took and passed their English college level course, just placed on changing the placement strategy. So we also looked at their proportion of students that enrolled in and passed any college level course. One thing I forgot to tell you up to now, but should have, is that all the results that are shown here are statistically significant. So we didn't put the little stars on, but these are all statistically significant at the 0.05 level. So we actually found a difference of about, well, you know, sorry, I got distracted for a moment. So we actually found a difference in the proportion of students who enrolled and passed any college level course. So certainly some of that is due to, you know, their English or math, but, you know, it could have been other ones as well. And we saw that there was about a half a credit difference in the number of college level credits earned first semester, again, just that, that one semester. So let me also show you the subgroup analyses, and then I'll stop again for a moment for any questions. So what we saw across, across groups here is that pretty much every subgroup that we looked at benefited by being placed using the algorithm method. So, Black, Hispanic, white, Pell, non-Pell, female, male. For some reason, females appear to benefit more than males. We don't yet have a large enough sample size to look at whether we are reducing the the gap, the achievement gap here. But what we can see is that all groups are benefiting by using this placement method. And so the last one was in English. This is in math. We see a similar pattern. So we see all groups benefiting from being placed. So this is, just considering that final college level math completion, enrollment and completion in the math college level math course. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I think I was, okay, so this, let me just make sure I've gotten this right. This was math placement. This is math completion. And now in English, again, we see a similar pattern, but perhaps more dramatic. You see every group benefiting from being placed using the new method, and every group showing higher rates of completion using the algorithm method. So before I go on to costs, let me stop for a minute and see if there are questions on that.
We don't have any additional questions yet.
Okay. So what did it cost? It was somewhat, the main cost that's taken into account here is actually people's time. And the cost was considerably greater for setup time than during subsequent semesters. And that's because it took a fair amount of time to assemble those historical data sets, do the analyses to develop the algorithm, and then to install the system into the college's existing placement apparatus. So that usually involved changes being made to the testing system, to the ways that the testing system interacted with the college's data systems and so on. So there was, as you can see here, there's a fair amount of difference by college. These are per student costs. But then semester following the initial semester, the costs drop quite a bit. So that's what we've learned so far about setting this up. And I did want to spend a minute just talking also about
Elizabeth,
yeah.
If I could interject a
Sure.
question, what specifically were the ongoing costs? And was that $40 for every student, or $40 when divided across the students who were benefited?
No, that's every student.
And,
yeah.
And what were those costs for?
Mostly extra time. So there was extra time involved typically in things like making sure that high school transcripts were obtained from every student, data entry to make sure that so these are above and beyond what colleges had been doing. So in many places they had not already been collecting high school GPAs. They hadn't routinely been entering them into the system. There were also changes in some cases to making sure that the data was uploaded into the testing system so it could be retrieved at the time it was needed for the placement, some for advising. So those are the kinds of things that were involved in ongoing testing, ongoing costs. Some of those may we may see them reduce in subsequent semesters too.
Thank you.
So implementation challenges. So it took, quite a lot of work, more than probably any of us really expected to get all of this into place. And what we found is that in the colleges we were working in, a lot of different people's lives were affected. So there were changes to that involved admissions people. There were changes that involved testing, counseling, registration, IT, and to some degree also faculty and classroom changes. So, colleges that participated were really went to bat, set up committees, set up communication systems. But, I think all of us learned a lot in the process about some of the challenges that were involved. So I just wanted to share a few of those. As people are thinking about it. There's a lot more information I should mention on all of this in a report that's on the CAPRA website on both the findings and what it took to implement these systems. So first, challenge one was, as I mentioned, lack of data for the well, no, I guess I hadn't mentioned this one. Lack of data for the algorithm due to multiple reforms. So using an algorithm system depends on having historical data. And as we all know, colleges have been doing a lot of work to change both the kinds of courses that they're offering in developmental education and the kinds of placement tests that they're using. So, when changes like that have been instituted, then you can't effectively predict, use the historical data to predict, to develop an algorithm that will be used in the future. So in some cases, we actually had to drop, only work in one subject area when there had been, a lot of changes in the other one. Missing high school GPAs was sometimes an issue. And, the algorithm that we developed incorporated missingness as a factor. But, that was a challenge that had to be dealt with. We talked about the concerns about the high school GPA availability being one, but then questions were raised about some of the issues that we discussed earlier. Communications within colleges, so making sure that the people whose lives were going to be affected were involved early on, making sure that decision makers were at the table and were fully engaged, and doing a lot of testing of the systems, were strategies that colleges used to make sure that it all worked out well. A lot of times it took, it was important to think ahead to some of the consequences. So, time of the IT staff, which is also often scarce, was needed to make sure that the whole system worked properly. We encountered a couple of places where classroom assignments, even classroom assignments had to be changed because the size of developmental classes were smaller than college level courses. So they had to think about, whether some adjustments needed to be made. In some cases, there were changes in the need, there were at least predicted to be changes in the needs for faculty, where different faculty qualifications were needed to teach developmental versus college level courses. So those were a couple of things that colleges were, spending a lot of time trying to think about ahead of time to make sure that, they weren't taken by surprise. One other thing that was something of an issue, although people got used to this really quickly, and with the single placement test, you can provide information right away. With the algorithm system, sometimes there was a delay in getting the placement information to students while, information was taken from a couple of different places and, combined into a final placement determination. So despite these different challenges, people were quite committed to the idea that students were benefiting from participating in a multiple measure system. They believed that the results that they were getting as they began to see the new system play out were more accurate, were more likely to allow students to take college level courses when they were ready. And overall it seemed like people were glad to have participated in this project. I should just mention that we're also involved in another project in Wisconsin and Minnesota where colleges are using a set of decision rules rather than an algorithm-based placement. So they're essentially drawing on existing research to come up with rules that they think will do a similar job, and we're in the process of doing a random assignment study there to learn about whether that works as well as this has. We're also doing, we're in the process now of collecting data for up to 5 semesters out for those first students in that first cohort, and we'll learn more about how those students did. So that's the end of my presentation, and
Excellent.
Questions I got so far. Are there any more?
There are a couple of questions, but there is a certificate that AMATIC awards, and so I'm going to thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Let John tell us about a survey link for those that need to fill that out, and then for those who are able, we have just a couple of questions, and Elizabeth, if you're willing to hang out until after John has done that, hopefully we can answer a couple of questions. But thank you so much on behalf of the MAA and on behalf of AMATIC, not only for doing your research, but also making the time for us today. John, you want to interject?
Yes, so let's all thank Elizabeth and Keith, the MAA, again in the chat room for this wonderful webinar today. So thank you for participating in today's AMATIC webinar, and if you'd like to support future AMATIC webinars, please consider becoming a member of AMATIC at bit.ly/join-AMATIC, and please remember to like AMATIC on Facebook at facebook.com/AMATIC, and recordings of past AMATIC webinars, including today's webinar, will be able to be found at bit.ly/AMATIC-webinars. So today's recording along with the slides will be located there shortly after the webinar. And as Keith alluded to, here is the link to today's survey. So please take a couple of minutes to evaluate the webinar content and the presenter today. And if you need email confirmation of your participation in this webinar, please fill in the optional section at the end of the evaluation, and I will make sure that you get your certificate as quickly as possible. So again, let's thank Elizabeth and Keith and the MAA in the chat today for the wonderful webinar, and I am going to end the recording